So welcome everybody. My name is Frances Andrews. I'm one of the vice presidents outgoing of the Royal Historical Society, and it's my great pleasure as my last duty to chair our outgoing president, Margot Finn's fourth and final lecture. Before we listen to Margot, however, we just want to hear a few words from my colleague, another vice president, Richard Fisher. So Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Frances. Good evening, everybody. Good evening from Cambridge. I'm Richard Fisher. Until about half an hour ago, I was a vice president of the Royal Historical Society. Very shortly, Professor Margot Finn will deliver her final presidential address to the RHS, and it's my very pleasant duty this evening to propose, on behalf of the officers and the council of the Society, a very warm vote of thanks to Margot at the conclusion of her presidential term. Margot succeeded Peter Mandler as president of the Society 4 years ago, and her contribution as president, both to the historical profession and to the wider discipline of history, has been immense. Under Margot's presidency, the Society has continued its long transition from an instrument of what political scientists sometimes describe as club government to something rather more inclusive, rather more visible, and simply much more professionally active. Under Margot's presidency, the Society has become directly involved and made major public statements on gender, on race and ethnicity, on LGBTQ+ histories, on data, on issues of equality and diversity within British historical studies, as well as giving support to professional rights of early career researchers. These have all helped to give the Society a preeminent position amongst learned societies in the arts and humanities, and Margot has herself played a determinant role in all of these initiatives. Margot's properly historical emphasis as president has always been on evidence, and under her auspices, indeed very largely under her own authorship, the Society has issued a number of important and substantial policy statements around scholarly licensing and Creative Commons, around open access perhaps especially, and around the general direction of public policy as it has impacted the publication options of UK-based historians. She's been an active and long-standing participant in the Research Excellence Framework. At times, Margot has, in consequence, occupied the naughty step, a step I'm pleased to say that we have both shared. But throughout these discussions, Margot has ensured that RHS positions have always been supported by actual data, something sadly absent from all too many discussions in this increasing emotive area. Margot's work rate in office has been frankly awe-inspiring. Those of us who used to think that we didn't exactly mess about in our professional lives have been put to shame by Margot's energy and enthusiasm, complemented, importantly and happily, by a very good sense of humour. Margot is someone I'm proud to call a friend, and she has been a kind and sympathetic colleague to all involved in the workings of the Society. I want to end this vote of thanks, though, by returning, as we all should, to Margot the historian. In July of 2019, Margot was elected a Fellow of the British Academy, proper recognition of her scholarly contribution, and very shortly she will deliver her fourth and final presidential address. In a reversal of normal practice, perhaps I might, on behalf of everyone zooming into this meeting now, show my and indeed our very considerable appreciation of Margot's presidency, a truly remarkable tenure in the very long history of the Royal Historical Society.
Thank you, Richard, and well said. It's very heartfelt, and from all on council, I think I can say we have greatly enjoyed working with Margot, and it's been an extraordinary experience. So now we turn to Margot's lecture. So it gives me great pleasure to present Margot Finn's final lecture, Material Turns in British History 4, Erasures, Empire in India, Council Cultures and the Country House. Margot, over to you.
Thank you so much, Frances, and thank you very much, Richard, for those very kind words. I would say they've left me speechless, but that would be a very unfortunate circumstance in this instance. Excellent. Here we go. This is my fourth lecture for the Royal Historical Society on material turns in British history, exploring how attention to colonial and material cultures can enhance our understanding of the British past. This lecture has been composed in what can only be described as historic times, against a backdrop of environmental calamity and amidst a global epidemiological crisis, historians labor today in the throes of a so-called culture war, in which empire and colonialism are key protagonists. Cancel cultures are conspicuous in the armory of this cultural conflict. Cancel culture refers to the popular practice of withdrawing support for or cancelling public figures and companies after they have done or said something considered objectionable or offensive, the Pop Culture Dictionary explains. Cancel culture is generally discussed as being performed on social media in the form of group shaming. History has come under repeated fire from all political sides and generational cohorts in this context. In tonight's lecture, I pick up a few highly visible threads among the rich tapestry of this contemporary conflict and seek, by locating the British country house within histories of imperialism, to situate today's culture wars in both a broader and a longer historical context. My lecture is in 3 parts. I begin with a sweeping and necessarily superficial survey of today's soi-disant culture war in Britain, focusing on its dominant timelines and cast of characters, and noting the peculiar erasure of the East India Company that characterizes social media-enabled debates about British imperialism. I turn in the next 2 sections to the closely entwined histories of the East India Company and the British country house, suggesting that erasure and selective historical amnesia, cancelling, if you will, were woven into the history of the stately home in the Georgian and early Victorian years in ways that prefigure 20th and 21st century repressions and reimaginings of empire in the public and the scholarly imagination. In my conclusion, I return to our contemporary culture war, underlining the need to push beyond facile conceptions of the past that cancel or deny earlier generations' participation in robust, contentious debates about the domestic impact of the British Empire. Not only school and university curriculums, museums, and cultural organizations such as the National Trust, but also commercial venues, the Church of England, the military, and representatives of the monarchy are now caught up in the legacies of this contested heritage. If we are to engage intelligently with these debates, I suggest, it behooves us to understand their extended, conflicted genealogy. Do we live in times riven by one or more culture wars? The popular press, some politicians, and many Twitter users are convinced that we do. Their conviction resounds from the pages of the Daily Mail, which locates the key battlefields of the culture war in identity politics, most notably in claims for racial equality that have been brought to the forefront of public consciousness by Black Lives Matter. Reporting in June 2020, the Prime Minister had selected Munira Mirza to set up his new race commission. The Mail proclaimed, Number 10 declares war on woke. Boris Johnson is taking on cultural battles over statues to shore up Tory base. As monuments to local worthies and national icons have toppled from or trembled on their pedestals, history and history's alleged cancellation have loomed increasingly large in this narrative of cultural Armageddon. September 2020 saw the actor Lawrence Fox announce his determination to launch a new political party in the aftermath of his assertion that pervasive discussions of racism in the media were boring. The Daily Mail's report of Fox's initiative quoted his claim that the people of the United Kingdom are tired of being told that we represent the very thing we have in history stood together against, noting his objective of celebrating Britain's cultural history in the face of such critiques. In newspapers, on Twitter, and within both houses of Parliament, culture war and cancel culture are now bandied about by conservative commentators as signifiers of all that is wrong with a section of the public they identify as a cacophonous minority opposed to the common sense traditionalism of a silent majority. The revival of large-scale anti-racism protest in Britain in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd on the 25th of May 2020 has both accelerated this conflict and focused it increasingly on histories of empire, race, and nation. In July 2020, Conservative MP John Hayes launched the Common Sense group of MPs and peers to deliver on the Conservative pledge to control immigration and so keep faith with blue-collar Tory voters. By September, The Times was reporting that members of this new assemblage had joined forces with the European Research Group to refuse unconscious bias training intended to tackle racism in the Commons, accusing parliamentary authorities of pandering to the woke agenda. I would rather gouge my eyes out with a blunt stick than sit through that Marxist snake oil crap, said one. Ben Bradley, newly elected Conservative MP for Mansfield, self-professed first blue brick in the red wall, and unconscious bias training refusenik, tweeted in October, critical race theory and the Black Lives Matter organization are not an innocent anti-racism campaign, it's political ideology and should be treated as such. More sober and sustained is the History Matters campaign launched by the centre-right think tank Policy Exchange in June. Led by the former chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, this project is guided by a panel of 11 historians, public figures, and people interested in history. We all want to find ways to improve the life opportunities and outcomes for people from BAME backgrounds, Trevor Phillips wrote in explaining the group's rationale. But what concerns me about the current moment is the rapid and unthinking way in which large swathes of our public heritage are being effectively rewritten or erased entirely, much of it seemingly without much proper debate or forethought. In both its visual iconography and its straplines, History Matters reflects wider claims that historians, like turkeys voting for Christmas, are intent to cancel history. Led emblematically by Richard Lionheart, its advocates underline public concern for the rewriting of history, assert that 2/3 of people say judging our past with today's values is mistaken, allege rock-bottom support for removing historical statues, including Churchill, and have issued a call for evidence as history becomes the focus of a culture war. These sentiments have travelled rapidly along the corridors of power, with important ramifications for history in schools, universities, and cultural organizations. In September, Oliver Dowden, the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, sent 26 cultural organizations in England a letter warning them against removing statues or other objects of contested cultural heritage from public display at the risk of losing their public funding. In October, in a speech delivered at the end of Black History Month, Kemi Badenoch, Minister for Equalities, asserted firmly that in schools and universities, our curriculum does not need decolonizing, and warned that any school uncritically teaching critical race theory is breaking the law. In November, Conservative wife peer Baroness Eaton intervened to ask Her Majesty's government what assessment they have made of steps taken by some universities to decolonize the history curriculum, and what plans they have given to issue guidance to universities on making the history curriculum as previously taught available to students. That history not only matters, but is also fundamentally different, rings out in these debates. MPs and peers do not argue that the teaching of evolution in schools and universities must be balanced by creationist pedagogy, nor, thank goodness, do they suggest that compulsory relationship teaching and LGBT+ equality in primary schools must be matched by compulsory lessons on how to be homophobic. When it comes to history, however, science, in the sense of Wissenschaft, or the systematic pursuit of knowledge, not only flies out the window, it is held up to ridicule and opprobrium. In the common parlance of our times, it is cancelled. What are the defining features of the history that proponents of this dominant paradigm of culture war propound? A Policy Exchange History Matters project provides useful evidence for answering that question. In June, the group established a webpage to register examples of Britain's culture war under 4 main rubrics: statue removals, name changes, apologies, and decolonizing the curriculum. 3 further editions have now augmented this rolling compendium. Adorned by images of government ministers, They add art symbols, museums, galleries and institutions, education and public spaces, or a roster that echoes lists of the war dead inscribed on memorial monuments. The presentation of these data is unsystematic, and policy exchange offers no information on any selection criteria for inclusion or exclusion they have applied. Nonetheless, several salient features emerge from the 99 entries. Material culture and the built environment feature prominently in History Matters' understanding of history's pedagogic duty. 24% of their entries mention the renaming of buildings, roads, or schools, while 23% mention public statues, busts, or commemorative plaques. In contrast, only 13% reference the decolonization of university curriculums. The absence of women from this monumental vision of history is a notable but unremarked characteristic of the History Matters campaign. Public monuments controlled by local councils dominated the first edition, but the project's fourth edition turned attention increasingly to cultural and educational organizations, renewing its call for evidence, asking museum directors, curators, teachers, and the wider public to share their experiences and concerns about the way in which history is being politicized and sometimes distorted. The History Matters group emphatically proclaims its own approach to the past to be free of politics. In cataloguing these examples, we do not offer any judgment on the actions of the individual or institution in question, their website asserts. This claim sits uncomfortably with the group's conclusion, unchanged since it began to gather its evidence, that history today is the most active front in a new culture war, and that action is being taken boldly and quickly in a way that does not reflect public opinion or growing concern over our treatment of the past. These conflicting statements rest uneasily on the compendium's evidence, much of which lacks the conventional referencing that would allow the reader to test its veracity. Spot checks of the patchy references and cited texts do not always inspire confidence. Item 12 of the second edition, for example, is headed by the bold claim that more than 180 historians have called on the Home Office to remove the history element of the UK citizenship test. Navigating beyond History Matters' broken link to a mistitled history journal that supposedly supports this claim, a persistent reader can view the offending letter in full via the Guardian website, as published in History, the official journal of the Historical Association. Here, we learn that the 180 historians, of whom I am one, have not called for history to be removed from the Home Office test. Instead, they have requested that the factual errors with respect to the histories of slavery and empire with which the current test is larded be removed rather than remaining compulsory learning for prospective UK citizens. Based on a tendentious evidence base, the History Matters project is at least as illuminating for what it leaves out as for what it takes into its purview. The place of the East India Company in Britain's imperial pantheon is one of these many salient silences. Like the 50-ish% of the population that is female, British imperial expansion in South Asia is conspicuous for its absence from view. A passing reference to Lord Adonis's desire to topple the statue of Robert Clive and a equally cursory mention of a proposal by Ealing Council to rename Havelock Road as Guru Nanak Road appear to represent the full extent of India's place in the British Empire until the celebrated life of Winston Churchill. Yet, East India Company men do feature unacknowledged in the History Matters website. Item 4 of the first edition of its Compendium of Evidence, for example, instances Chester Council's discussion of whether to remove a large equestrian statue of Viscount Combermere from the city centre. Field Marshal Stapleton Cotton, 1st Viscount Combermere, was a military leader, diplomat, and politician, and made a field marshal in 1855, the History Matters website observes. He served under the Duke of Wellington in the Peninsular War. Absent from this analysis is the rationale for the debate on Combermere's statue. He served as governor of Barbados from 1817 to 1820 and was financially compensated for his ownership by Parliament of 420 enslaved persons on Nevis and St. Kitts in 1834. Also missing from this description of Combermere's valour is his career in India. A veteran of the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, Combermere first met Wellington not in Europe, but in the Madras Presidency, where both men established their military repute. The full title reflects contemporary recognition of the central part that India played throughout his career. He was Viscount Combermere of Burtpore in the East Indies, because as Commander-in-Chief of India in the 1820s, he presided over the reduction of a Maratha fort long held to be impregnable. Selective amnesia of the East India Company's place in the wider fabric of the British Empire is by no means peculiar to the Policy Exchange's initiative. Rather, it characterizes wider public rememberings and forgettings of empire in India in our so-called culture war. Why does India in general, and the East India Company in particular, play such a limited role in present-day discussions of the British Empire? Debates spurred by the Black Lives Matter movement, unsurprisingly, focused attention on the slave systems of the Atlantic world and the role played by slave trading and slave-owning British men in upholding them. In turning attention to India, it is not my intention to efface those vitally important histories, but rather to locate them in a wider imperial system in which Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds were both entwined and mutually sustaining. Combermere's biography, like his stately home in Cheshire, embodies this entanglement. A Cistercian foundation established in the 12th century, Combermere Abbey passed into the Cotton family with the dissolution of the monasteries. Newly knighted by Henry VIII, Sir George Cotton gained the abbey and its 22,000 acres in the 1540s and promptly demolished its main buildings, a salutary reminder that processes of erasure have played an integral part in forging Britain's four nations for centuries. The resulting Tudor manor house was remodeled by successive generations, obtaining its current Gothic style at the behest of the first Viscount in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. Today, the Abbey operates as a luxury wedding venue, steeped in 1,000 years of English history. What does it mean to be steeped in English history? The History tab of the Combermere Abbey website depicts the English past as an insular national history, shorn of references to colonial wealth and imperial military exploits. The high points of this potted history offer a sharp contrast to the evidence presented to the public by Combermere's family and friends in the Georgian and Victorian eras. Here, we find instead a man propelled into empire by the profligate hospitality of his father, whose devotion to country pursuits had forced the sale of family estates valued at £200,000, or over £8 million in today's currency. Service as governor in Barbados and then as commander-in-chief of India clearly reflected Combermere's staunch conservative values. But his imperial career also reflected his financial exigencies. These were exceptionally lucrative salaried posts, in the case of the commander-in-chiefship, augmented further by prize money awarded for successful military campaigns. While serving as governor of Barbados in the 1810s, Combermere refashioned the abbey in Gothic style, installing a Wellington wing to commemorate the senior officer with whom he had served both at the storming of Seringapatam in India in 1799 and later in the Peninsular War. Inside the abbey, behind its new mock Gothic facade, the impress of India is readily discerned in material culture acquired by the commonplace practices of empire in South Asia, conquest, gifting, loot, and prize. Combermere was an adept practitioner of the acquisitive collecting practices associated with East India Company military campaigns. Writing to the Governor-General, Lord Amherst, during the reduction of Bratpur Fort, he provided detailed military intelligence interlaced with news of the items seized from the Rajah's palace he was sending as gifts to Amherst, his wife, and his daughter. The treasure taken by his army was valued at £480,000, in excess of £27 million today, of which £500 was expended to mount 2 brass field pieces presented by the army to the Commander-in-Chief. They now stand in a gallery at Combermere Abbey, lined with armour and every description of weapon. Mary, Viscountess Combermere, and Captain Mollis reported in their Memoirs and Correspondence of Combermere in 1866. Elevated to Viscount for this victory, Combermere, as Commander-in-Chief, was entitled to 1/8 of the Bratpur prize money, a hefty sum worth just under £3.5 million today. The months that followed this victory in 1826 saw Combermere travel throughout the upper provinces of Bengal, reviewing his troops, engaging in diplomacy with Indian princes, and collecting artwork and armour for display in his English country house. Among the Indian princely states, which the East India Company was variously using to shore up its power and seeking to supplant, the Viscount found many elite Indian advocates of a country house aesthetic compatible with his own. The newly installed King of Awadh, he reported to his sister, has, besides his many palaces, 5 or 6 country houses, quite English, with English furniture and pictures. Diplomatic encounters such as these entailed lavish celebrations in which Indian princes and the Commander-in-Chief exchanged elaborate, costly gifts. East India Company policy strictly prohibited the retention of these presents by British officers, but the printed memoirs published by Combermere's family and friends in the Victorian era clearly documented the flow of gifted Indian weaponry from these diplomatic encounters to Combermere Abbey. The Rajah of Patiala, a connoisseur of both Indian and English material culture, gifted the Commander-in-Chief a complete suit of chain armour inlaid with gold, a sword and shield, a bow and arrows, and a dagger, the Viscount's Victorian biographers noted. These may now be seen in the armoury at Combermere, side by side with many other weapons obtained during his residence in India, they observed. Policy Exchanges History Matters project identifies historians who draw attention to English material culture's imbrication with empire as a woke cavalry intent to distort national history by rewriting it. Taking a longer view, however, of East India Company material culture, it is the 20th century's erasure of these colonial connections that is most striking, rather than historians' more recent attention to them. Already in the 19th century, Viscount Combermere's family and friends, no woke snowflakes they, drew repeated attention to the material legacies that flowed to Cheshire from India during his imperial career. There is no need to fall prey to the error against which Policy Exchange warns us, that is, judging our past with today's values, to acknowledge a fact self-evident to the Victorians. Empire and the violence upon which it was founded were bedrocks of the modern British nation-state, providing the men who governed it with wealth, status, and power that took conspicuous physical form in their stately homes. Combermere Abbey's hybrid East and West Indian material culture is hardly anomalous. In September 2020, the National Trust published a report which identified 93 properties in its care in England and Wales with links to colonialism, including 29 whose proprietors, like Combermere, received financial compensation for Parliament's abolition of slavery in 1834. Ruffling many feathers, this important report amplified research on a much wider population of stately homes already in the public domain. In 2014, for example, historian Stephanie Barshevsky identified hundreds of landed estates and country houses acquired with imperial wealth from 1700 to 1930. Of these, 229 were purchased or restored with East Indian fortunes between 1700 and 1850. the heyday of East India Company's men's stately home acquisition extended from the 1760s through the 1810s. Counties such as Angus, Berkshire, Hertfordshire, and Perthshire featured especially prominently in this architectural feeding frenzy, but stately homes built with East India Company fortunes punctuated the landscape across Britain in these years. To be sure, not all Georgians and Victorians were as willing as Viscount Combermere to draw attention to the South Asian wellsprings of their country house lifestyles. In the stately homes of men from mercantile backgrounds who aspired to gentility, and of members of the lesser gentry whose economic precarity threatened their status, a more self-conscious marriage between Indian wealth and material culture emerged. These men's architectural preferences, artistic tastes, and furnishing choices point us to a pervasive strand of imperial amnesia mediated by their stately homes, structures that were both made possible by colonial lives and used to mask the traces of empire in the families they funded and maintained. The desire to preserve, repurchase, or acquire a country house as a family seat repeatedly recurs in the biographies of the leading men who drove East India Company policies, both on the subcontinent and in Parliament. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography entry for Robert Clive notes that, born into a venerable but impecunious gentry family, Clive experienced a peripatetic childhood and spent much time away from his parents and their Shropshire country house. On his first return from the subcontinent in 1753, Clive unsurprisingly used his Indian fortune of £40,000 to pay his family's debts, including the mortgage on the family seat. Together with the purchase of new landed estates, his country house base allowed him to enter Parliament and build an East India Company interest in the House of Commons. Likewise, Warren Hastings used the savings garnered from his Indian career to recuperate the estate in Worcestershire, to which his family traced its history continuously from the 12th century. Returning to England in 1785, Hastings immediately set about trying to realize the objective he had long set himself, the recovery of the Daylesford estate for the Hastings family, the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography tells us. Commissioning a new family seat by Samuel Pepys Cockerell, Hastings spent £60,000 of his £220,000 Indian fortune on Daylesford and its pleasure grounds, which he occupied with his wife from 1791, living the life of a country gentleman engaged in local affairs and farming. If we examine the external signifiers of East India Company men's country houses, processes of imperial erasure, Georgian era architectural pencil culture, if you will, become conspicuously evident. Samuel Pepys Cockerell's most famous English country house is not his reconstruction of Warren Hastings' beloved Daylesford, but instead the nearby new home he designed for his own elder brother, Charles, in 1805. Charles, later Sir Charles Cockerell, retired from the East India Company civil service as a wealthy nabob in 1801. He was typical of a late Georgian generation of company men enriched far beyond their mercantile origins and determined to translate their prodigious Indian wealth into social and political power at home through family seats set on landed estates and parliamentary seats at Westminster. The entrance of these men into the House of Commons stoked fears of an Oriental overthrow of British liberties. Cockerell indeed first sat for a notoriously corrupt Cornwall constituency that was in the gift of his fellow nabob, Richard Barwell. But his country seat, fashioned in a pastiche of Indian architectural styles, now termed Neo-Mughal or Indo-Saracenic, is entirely atypical of East India Company country houses. Seasoncote House reputedly inspired the Prince of Wales's construction of the Royal Pavilion at Brighton, but it failed to capture the imaginations of East India Company men. Their characteristic architectural aesthetic spanned from the monastic abbey to mock Gothic structures, but it was firmly centered in Palladianism and its neoclassical offshoots. These dominant styles rejected Indian influences, adopting instead the forms and ornament of ancient Roman buildings to create an architecture based on symmetry, proportion, and perspective. Sir Francis Sykes's new country house at Basildon Park in Berkshire and Sir Thomas Rumbold's new house at Woodall Park in Hertfordshire exemplify this trend. In Wales, William Paxton's neoclassical new build Middleton Hall likewise emphatically announced that this erstwhile East India Company surgeon had arrived in the gentry. North of the border, Navarre House no less triumphantly signalled the return of Sir Hector Munro to his ancestral lands with the spoils of Indian warfare, which allowed him dramatically to expand his family home, reconfiguring its footprint as a classical square. Nabob was a term of abuse in Georgian Britain, a Persian word that designated a provincial governor in the Mughal Empire. Nawab was transmogrified into nabob by vociferous British critics of the East India Company's nascent empire in the aftermath of Clive's victory at Plassey. To contemporaries, nabobism signified all that was wrong with the East India Company and its rule: famine and exploitation on the subcontinent, followed by an inflow of excessive new wealth and political corruption to Britain, both signified by the purchase and extravagant refashioning of rural stately homes. Here is a specimen of the new aristocracy created against the natural interests of this kingdom, Edmund Burke declaimed in the House of Commons in 1785, excoriating the nabob Paul Benfield, a criminal who long since ought to have fattened the region's kites with his offal, is enfeoffed within a state which effaces the splendor of all the nobility of Europe, Burke raged. James Gilray's 1797 caricature of Benfield, riding in front of his Palladian country house in Hertfordshire, registered the perceived dangers to the polity of this Asian wealth by racializing Benfield as Black. In this fraught political context, not least among the virtues of neoclassical and neo-Gothic country house facades, was their role in downplaying the South Asian origins of company men's wealth and power. Inside stately homes, Georgian and early Victorian propertied elites navigated uneasily between the celebration, the domestication, and the denial of the Indian taproots of their British fortunes. Armorial porcelain crafted in Jindajin and elaborate Chinese wallpaper were luxury furnishings accessible only to families with East India Company connections. Highly prized by members of the Georgian governing elite, today they are carefully preserved in the collections of the National Trust, providing a visual record of patterns of imperialism whose virtues have been hotly contested in Britain since the 18th century. Women participated actively in the imperial collecting practices that shaped this material culture. In South India, while her husband, the governor of Madras presidency, worked to install a new Hindu princely government after the defeat of Tipu Sultan in 1799, Lady Henrietta Clive travelled extensively throughout Mysore. Accompanied by her teenage daughters, she collected loot, booty, and luxury merchandise for Palace Castle, the family seat in Wales. Here, the ornate chintz tent that had earlier accompanied Tipu Sultan on travels to survey his domains offered an arresting visual reminder of his defeat when put to domestic use at Lady Clive's elite garden parties. In Georgian portraiture, we find intriguing material traces of the Black lives that mattered to the elite status of this imperial ruling class. Many South Asian domestic workers accompanied East India Company families from the subcontinent to stately homes in Britain, both as servants and as enslaved domestic staff. Sir Hector Munro returned home from his Indian campaigns with an entourage that included a Black slave, a native of the East Indies, called Caesar, who, having absconded from his master's country house in 1771, was advertised for in the Caledonian Mercury. In the early 19th century, having retired to Berkshire from Bengal, William Hickey was attended by and painted with his Indian manservant, William Manu. Their joint portrait, exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1820, designated William Manu as Black, reminding us of the extended timeline and complex composition of Black British histories. Hickey's social circle in Bengal had included the family of Sir Henry Russell. In England, he resumed his friendship with Lady Russell, who had returned home with her youngest Indian-born children and 2 Indian servants, while her husband and eldest sons remained in India, accumulating the capital with which in 1820 they would purchase a stately home. As Lady Russell tested country house life in Surrey, Kent, and Somerset, she was accompanied and supported by Indian attendants. I have found both my Black women faithful good souls. As to Anne Eyre, she really has so attached herself to me that I think I can never part with her, Lady Russell wrote in 1805. Anne Eyre, who is now called Mrs. Williams, being my maid, I cannot part with. She is in many respects superior to an English servant, and in no one inferior. Her attachment to me is quite wonderful, she enthused a year later. Berkshire country house Lady Russell's husband and eldest son acquired in 1820, Swallowfield Park, embodies in its history, fabric, and furnishings many of the contradictions, silences, and erasures that marked and masked East India Company material culture. Its exterior gives no sign of Swallowfield's extended connection with empire in the East and the West Indies. But the Russells' extensive family archive sheds substantial light on its many vestiges of empire, some obscured, but others displayed in plain view. Henry Russell, his father, Sir Henry Russell, had served as Chief Justice in Bengal, amassed a substantial collection of Indian art while serving as the company's diplomatic representative at Hyderabad. At Swallowfield, this artwork, a portrait of Russell by Romney, and copies of paintings by old masters Russell had acquired with his Indian savings, together adorned the walls. Keen to consolidate and burnish his family's lineage, the second baronet carefully constructed a gallery of family portraits, commissioning the society artist David Wilkie to retouch a painting of his paternal grandmother to make her more genteel. Excluded from Swallowfield's family gallery, however, was Henry's mixed-race daughter, Mary Wilson, one of 3 children born to him and his several Indian concubines. Sent home to Britain on a separate ship to her father, his wife, and their legitimate white children, Mary was established at a boarding school in Clapham and trained up to be a governess, under the guardianship of Major Pittman, a retired East India Company military officer who had served at Hyderabad with her father. Dispatched as an adolescent to service in a Devonshire country house, Mary Wilson repeatedly begged her guardian to know whose child she was. Her father was adamant both that his identity be kept from her and that she should not step foot in his Berkshire country house. Material legacies of empire were clearly one thing to display, human legacies quite another. There is no need, anachronistically, to apply 21st century sensibilities to censor Henry Russell's treatment of his mixed heritage daughter. Her guardian, Major Pittman, as well as Henry's brothers and in-laws, were both bemused and infuriated by his intransigence on this score. The dear child's mind for some time back has been much agitated on the subject of her birth, of which I have avoided giving her any explanation. Major Pittman wrote to Sir Henry in 1838. At her age, it is natural she should think deeply on a subject so interesting to her, and I hope you will agree with me in setting her mind at rest regarding it, he pleaded. Russell's brothers, his wife's sister, and his brother-in-law all happily met with and acknowledged Mary Wilson, commenting openly on her physical resemblance to her father. But Russell, citing the interests of his wife and legitimate white daughters to justify his reasoning, repeatedly refused to declare his paternity. For the present, I am satisfied that we cannot tell Mary whose daughter she is, he wrote to Pittman in 1839. In the first place, I could not tell her who she is without at the same time receiving her, at least occasionally, into my house. And I find what is perhaps not only natural but proper, that Lady R would object to this, at all counts while her own daughters are unmarried. Tracking the Indian capital inherited by Henry Russell's sisters, Mary Wilson's aunts, also leads us into English country houses. Like Swallowfield, at first glance, the stately homes they inhabited in Lancashire and Devon appear to be quintessentially English. The drawing room of Henrietta Green, née Russell's country house, was filled with fine furniture, crafted locally by Gillows of Lancaster. But the house itself, Whittington Hall, was a new build, financed in no small part with capital from Henrietta's dowry, funded by savings from her father's salary as a judge on the Calcutta Supreme Court. The neoclassical exterior of Winslade Park, the country house in Devon, in which Henry's sister Rose resided, likewise simultaneously reflected and concealed imperial fortunes. Constructed earlier in the century for the nabob Edward Cotsford, Winslade had been purchased by Rose Porter née Russell's father-in-law, who was the proprietor of substantial estates in British Guiana. Rose's dowry provided an injection of Indian capital into the Porter finances when she married into the family in 1820. Abolition in 1834 brought the couple a second financial windfall. As the proprietor of 709 enslaved humans, Porter received £35,960 in compensation from Parliament, just under 2.5 million in today's money. At multiple levels and across the generations, country house material culture played vital roles in effacing the imperial past from contemporaries' memory. This selective amnesia was neither a passive nor an innocent process. We can trace its lineaments alike in stately home construction and the decorative arts that defined a new Georgian country house aesthetic, and in Victorian family history writing. The biography of a silver-gilt presentation vase at Swallowfield brings this process of imperial erasure into clear view. In 1901, Swallowfield's then chatelaine, Lady Constance Russell, published a biography of her marital home, rooting its place in history firmly in the Tudor era and underlining its historic ties to the British monarchy. The commemorative vase, dating from 1823, was one of the very few Russell family ties to India she chose to acknowledge. Funded by a subscription of over £1,000 presented to Henry Russell on his departure from Hyderabad in 1820, this decorative object, Lady Russell proudly proclaimed, was a small token of his colleagues' appreciation for Russell's imperial service. The records in the East India Company's archive tell a very different story. In 1818, 2 years before his precipitate departure from Hyderabad, Russell had taken the law into his own hands, stepping beyond his diplomatic authority to order the flogging of 2 Indian men implicated in a robbery in the city's bazaar. He subjected each man to 1,000 lashes, a punishment administered by his brother-in-law. Within 2 days, both prisoners were dead. The company's military officers of Hyderabad swiftly mobilized in defense of this brutal flogging, but the Governor-General and Council in Calcutta were outraged at Russell's actions, and he resigned his post before he could be sacked. The vase, a tribute of grateful remembrance funded by his subordinates at Hyderabad, was commissioned in the aftermath of this disgrace and proudly displayed at Swallowfield. Unsurprisingly, when it was auctioned in Salisbury in 2010, it was Lady Russell's patriotic version of its provenance, not the archival record of its contested heritage, that the auctioneers cited in their catalogue. Today, contested heritage figures prominently in the so-called culture war that rages across parliamentary politics, heritage organizations, educational institutions, and social media. The Secretary of State for Culture has warned ostensibly arm's-length heritage organizations they risk their funding if they politicize history, while the Minister for Equalities has charged any school teacher who uncritically deploys critical race theory with breaking the law. On Twitter and in the pages of the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, and the Times, these sentiments have found a warm reception, as indignant readers have declaimed against cancel culture, even as they have ostentatiously withdrawn their support from charities such as the National Trust by destroying their membership cards and cancelling their subscriptions. In this lecture, I have used the entwined material histories of the East India Company and the British country house to question two fundamental premises of our 21st century culture wars. First, my reading of the imperial histories of stately homes since the 18th century challenges the claim made by projects such as Policy Exchange's History Matters that present-day critiques of Britain's imperial past represent a novel, present-minded, woke challenge to Britain's shared conception of the nation and its history. Rather, by pointing to Georgian-era diatribes against the East India Company's nabobs, I have suggested that such critiques were fundamental to many 18th and 19th century men and women's understandings of their own times. In the fabric, the artwork, and the decorative cultures of the country houses they inhabited, we can trace a much earlier, highly politicized genealogy of heritage contests, which continues to animate public understanding of the past today. By the Victorian era, Palladian and Neo-Gothic architecture had definitively triumphed over the Neo-Mughal Indo-Saracenic style, championed by Samuel Pepys Cockerell. By attending to the longer histories of British attitudes to empire, we can begin to understand why. For the frequent assertion that critiques of imperialism today anachronistically subject past generations to 21st century belief systems itself effaces from the historical record men, women, and children who challenged slavery, racial bias, and imperial conquest decades, indeed centuries ago. Their histories, too, can be found in the archives and in the artistic legacies of the country house, if we choose to seek them, rather than complacently, unthinkingly asserting that our own moral values today invariably trump those of the generations that preceded us. Second, my interpretation questions the commonplace claim that by rewriting familiar narratives of national icons such as country houses, historians fundamentally distort the settled verities of a stable past. Instead, I have suggested that rewriting history was an essential function of the country house, and that Georgian and Victorian families residing in stately homes were fully alive to this political purpose. The selective acquisition of desirable imperial luxuries, the selective exclusion of mixed-race progeny, and the selective rewriting of family members' records of colonial service are all conspicuous in the amnesiac archives of Britain's stately homes. Nor is recognition of the integral role of selective remembering and forgetting and shaping nations a modish, politically correct, new development of our own century. Rather, it has been an axiom of historical analysis since at least the Victorian period. Ernest Renan, who was a close friend and intellectual companion of Sir Mountstuart Grant Duff, a fourth president of the Royal Historical Society, a former governor of Madras and no woke snowflake, articulated this argument forcefully in What is a Nation, published in 1882. Forgetting, I would even say historical error, is an essential factor in the creation of a nation, and it is for this reason that the progress of historical studies often poses a threat to nationality, Renan observed. Historical inquiry, in effect, throws light on the violent acts that have taken place at the origin of every political formation, even those that have been the most benevolent in their consequences. Unity is always brutally established, Renan argued. Bitterly contested at the time of its rapid territorial expansion and the aftermath of Clive's victory at Plassey, the East India Company played an instrumental role in forging the modern British state. Beyond passing mentions of Clive's statue at Whitehall, however, references to Britain's extended imperial history in South Asia are thin on the ground in the culture wars of the 21st century. This absence speaks eloquently to the ease with which we all fall prey to historical amnesia, and to the success with which earlier generations campaigned in and through their stately homes to encourage us to do so. It is not the historian's role to serve as the handmaiden of public opinion by amplifying that pervasive, carefully constructed, selective view of the past, a view that is itself merely the most recent iteration of a long succession of interested forgettings and rememberings. Rather, rewriting history is precisely what historians do. It is how history works. There is no need to enter the lists of a novel culture war to rewrite the history of Britain's imperial past. That pathway is already well trodden, thanks to our Georgian and Victorian forebears.
Thank you, Margot. That was fabulous. A real demonstration of previous erasures and the power of history. Congratulations. Thank you very much indeed. As I said at the beginning, please put any questions into the chat, and we will now have a pause while Margot has a brief break, and then we can come back and discuss the questions. Great. Okay, so I think we're ready for the questions. Margot, there's quite a group around buildings, so I'm going to start with the first, and then you'll get a chance to develop on those, I hope. I'll just read you firstly from one of your predecessors, your immediate predecessor, in fact, Peter Mandler. Margot, beautifully judged lecture. You alluded on a number of occasions to the way in which classical styles act as a neutral, in quotation marks, screen for the truly cosmopolitan origins of British wealth and property. Contemporaries also complained that classicism was itself a cosmopolitan style that obscured properly English origins, which is part of the Gothic riposte. Could you talk a little more about the specific values that classical style was supposed to broadcast, and how did they comment implicitly on empire?
Thank you very much. And Peter obviously knows a lot more about stately homes than I do, but fortunately he's on mute. So I hope he's going to accept at least part of the answer I'm about to give him. I think, and this is obviously something that one can't demonstrate definitively, that a part of what is going on is a generation of men who typically, particularly in the 18th century, left formal schooling at 14, sometimes as young as 13, went to India and needed to construct themselves as gentlemen. And we have actually really, really rich records in their in inventories and wills of the books they owned. And Roman authors, Gibbon on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, that's a particular part of the mindset that through their other material culture, they're very engaged in constructing. So I think a part of the neoclassical exterior is also an attempt to argue or to demonstrate a furnishing of their minds, that they have a classical education, which in fact, quite transparently, many of them don't. And we can see this in the Hyderabad library that Henry Russell, later of Swallowfield Park, constructs. And he's got busts of Greek and Roman worthies. And then he has kind of a great men in the Western tradition traipsing all the way up to his own generation. And I think a part of this is a kind of architectural compensation, which we see also in their reading lists, their statues, their busts. And again, Henry Russell, when he's retired with his Indian fortune, does a number of grand tours in Italy. And he's there again buying old masters, but also Greco-Roman statuary. So I think it's of a piece and comes from that particular place rather than being only about separate architecture. I think it's part of a larger material culture that's trying to send us a particular message it is really, again, a message about absence, about an education these men did not have on the whole.
Thank you. That's a great and really thought-provoking answer. And it leads me to ask you another question, again on that same area, but moving to a different territory. Kate Telcher, and apologies, I've pronounced the name, asks, to what extent does the Palladian style become the architectural expression of colonial power in places like Government House in Kolkata, and the garden houses on the river Hooghly? So in other words, is that part of the same?
Very much. Excellent question. And hello, Kate. You absolutely see it in Government House. You see it in the Hyderabad Residency, which again has the same neoclassical architecture, and which also has the emblem of the East India Company over the door, so that you have to pass in under the emblem of East India Company authority. One of my favorite examples, which I couldn't winkle into this paper because it was already going to be trying your patience on a Friday evening, is a Scottish castle, which is then recreated in a mock form outside of Madras by an East India Company family. And the civil servant who is in Madras only because he cannot afford to keep his castle going unless he takes an East India Company fortune, creates a castle on the riverbanks outside of Madras, named after his own castle in a kind of, again, mock Gothic architecture. So I think that there's a lot of resonance there, both about projecting British power onto an Indian population, but also reminding oneself that one is British. And other examples I can think of, the first Earl Minto, who's Governor General in the early 19th century. He is in India to a significant extent to get dowries for his daughters. And again, I think writing the history of women back into this history of colonialism is important, but also to both keep Minto, the stately home, going and to expand it. And he keeps images in the office that he works in Calcutta, images of Minto, and writes longingly to his wife about being in Minto in his mind, even as he acquires wealth to entirely refashion, entirely rebuild Minto House, which his eldest son and his wife do in his absence.
Fantastic. Again, on the architecture, there are other themes in the questions. We'll get to those. Zoltan Biederman asks, you mentioned the way Neo-Palladian architecture served to erase the imperial origins of many family fortunes, which makes a lot of sense. Was it then that allowed Neo-Mughal architecture to happen? What was it? Sorry, a shift in attitude, a different mechanism of erasure? And they say, apologies if you explained this, I was cut off occasionally, but I don't think you did explain it. So.
I didn't explain it, Zoltan. I think that a couple of different things are going on here. If you're in India itself, you do see those architectural styles being used by the British in government buildings, and you can still see that today. So there is a willingness on the spot in India to use those architectural styles. But as I say, season code is really anomalous. It's very often taken as the icon of the nabob home, but almost no nabobs actually do that kind of architectural work in England, Scotland, Wales, or Ireland. And I think that's telling us something. So that the company and later the crown will build, courts and big government buildings that make statements about power and authority, borrowing from those styles. And Parta Mitter has written very powerfully about that. But we don't see that translating into English architectural, British architectural more broadly. And I think that's because of this very contentious debate. The East India Company, this expansion in India, it is not something that all of society or all of the political classes think should be going on. And we mustn't forget that there was this cacophonous, vitriolic debate at the time. That isn't an invention of the 21st century.
Thank you. That's a really, really useful reminder, I think, politically speaking. Moving away from buildings, there are lots more. We'll have to send you some of these because we're not going to be able to get through them all. And hopefully you can deal with them later. Pippa Catterall asks, other than critically responding to the assumptions and hidden political agendas of groups like Policy Exchange, what else can we do to challenge their assumptions to occlude uncomfortable imperial pasts? Asking for action, I think.
Yeah, I mean, one of the wonderful things that's happened in history in the past decade or so, partly because of social media, partly because of digitization of resources, is that history is much more open to everyone than it was in the past. And we can publicize evidence. We can bring evidence into the public domain much more readily than we could a decade ago. So I think a part of the response to that, and hello, Pippa, and thank you enormously for your work on the LGBT+ report, since I have you here. A part of what we can do is bringing evidence into public so that we can actually discuss it. And I think that's always the first step. History's got to be a house of many mansions. It's got to be a broad church. But if we all start by reviewing the evidence, reading the evidence, not the commentary on the evidence, I think that's dramatically important. And it's so much easier to get one's hands on the primary sources now, albeit archives and libraries are a wee bit closed with COVID. But there's so much evidence there that just by Googling, one can see. That would be my starting point, I think.
Thank you. Another question from Tim Ranker Williams. Thank you for a wonderful paper. I haven't been reading all the thanks, by the way. You can look at those after. Would you say more about how your research takes us beyond simplistic notions of Black versus white history? I was very struck by the evidence from caricatures and personal correspondence, which suggested that white British people in the 18th and 19th centuries were able to blur racial identities and categories for both good and ill.
Yeah, so part of what's happening here is the usage, the 18th century usage of the term Black, which absolutely encompasses people who in the 21st century one might call brown. So South Asians in the 18th century into the early 19th century are called Black by white people in Britain pretty much across the piece. And it creates, as I'm trying to suggest here, a wider, kind of richer version of the argument that I think David Olusoga, among others, has made very powerfully about this very extended genealogy of Black British history that doesn't start with Windrush. So, and we can see that the usage of the term Black again and again by contemporaries. Now, they're perfectly capable of distinguishing between what they perceive to be different races, and one sees that as well. But when they think about non-elite Indian people, they think about non-elite Indian people as being Black, and that there's no question there. So I think that word usage is very useful for us to bear in mind in this context.
Mm-hmm. There are then some questions about the interiors. One, Mirta Minert asks about how they follow Roman and Greek styles for the architecture, rather than being inspired by cultures explored overseas, but while decorating the insides of the houses, as well as the gardens, with objects and plants taken from colonial territories. And Mirta says this is based on practice in the Netherlands, but assuming it's the same. So how would you explain and contextualize these different tendencies, exterior, interior?
Yeah, so several years ago with funding from the Wellcome Trust, thank you, Wellcome Trust, I ran a project with a wonderful team, Kate Smith, Helen Clifford, Ellen Filer, and many others, including about 300 community-based and other historians. It was called the East India Company at Home. And the book of that project is free to download because it's open access. And it has a wonderful chapter in it by Yutika Sharma and Pauline Wilson, who was a volunteer at Osterley Park, a National Trust property. And the Osterley Park and the National Trust were just wonderfully generous to us. I cannot commend them enough. Now, Osterley has always been presented to the public, with good reason, as an extraordinary example of a Robert Adam neoclassical interior. That's what it is. There's absolutely no question. And it's a particularly fine example with its original bits and bobs still there. But the Child family who owned Osterley were East India Company directors. And that house has always been, since the 18th century, chock-a-block full of Chinese lacquerware, chock-a-block full of Indian textiles, Chinese textiles. So I think we shouldn't think of the neoclassical interior as something that's separate from the East India Company interior. It's very clear that a lot of bricolage, a lot of putting of these together was actually how people conceived of their interiors. And there's been some wonderful research done by National Trust researchers on Chinese wallpaper. Chinese wallpaper obviously is it's made for European market, so it's Chinese as in the sense it's made in China, but it's made for British and other European peoples. And some of the women who use Chinese wallpaper in Britain to adorn the walls of their stately homes, then cut out pictures from Audubon's books of birds and natural history and pasted onto the Chinese wallpaper. So I think thinking about that bricolage, that mixing of styles and what that means is an important part of reading the interior of the imperial stately home.
Fits with your arguments about entanglements. Yeah, very nice. There's then another thread. I'm sorry, I'm not doing justice to everybody's questions here, but another thread comes in with questions about the people involved. And Gad Hoyman asks, do you have a sense that Mary Wilson was typical or that her story was unusual?
Hello, Gad. Difficult to answer. One of the things that's exceptional about the story of Mary Wilson, who's one of the illegitimate children of Henry Russell, who is the resident or diplomatic agent at Hyderabad, is that it's exceptionally well documented. We have maybe 2 volumes, there's certainly one very fat volume in the Bodleian, of correspondence between her guardian, Major Pittman of the East India Company, and her father. We have very little from her, though I can pick her up in bits and bobs in the census. She marries a curate. She has a good life. She ends up in Kent. But there's an extraordinarily dense correspondence between her guardian and her father. And I think that's very, very unusual. But custody is an absolutely essential part of this colonial story. And in the larger book, which once I finish RHSing, I hope to finish, I have both mixed heritage illegitimate children and also the white illegitimate children. And I think it's really important to tell those stories together, to try to disentangle to what extent is the treatment meted out to them about their illegitimacy, and to what extent is that treatment about their race or their national origin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Another question is from Simon Morgan, who says, having as a teenager been enthusiastically shown around a Cheshire nabob's house by his descendant, who explained to me what a terrible carpetbagger he was, do we know what the owners of these properties think about these debates and effectively the attempt of certain groups and individuals to impose an accepted view of the past on them?
Yes, there are a couple, I'm not going to name names because that could become invidious, who absolutely have embraced this sort of approach and said, I'm not responsible for my ancestors, which I think is a perfectly fair thing to say, but I, as the custodian of this stately home, need to bring its full history into the public light. There are, however, some commercial venues that now operate commercial enterprises in these that have threatened to sue people for bringing the history into the public domain. So it really goes the full spectrum. Some embrace it, some reject it, and most do a fairly interesting navigation between those two positions.
Fascinating. Yeah, not surprising, I suppose. I think there's just one last question that is a sort of on a new area, and that's really just asking about who was doing the building of these things. Angela McShane would like to know a little bit more about how and by whom pseudo-Indian style buildings were built. So do we know anything about that? Were they bringing in?
Season coat, we do know. So the brother who built it for his brother is actually the surveyor based in London for the East India Company. So this is a man who is connected through his brother and through his London-based East India Company employment with many other East India Company men. He builds other houses that are neoclassical. So he does other work, as for Hastings, that does not look at all like Season-Cote. And I think what's exceptional there is a new build from the ground up that has this really quite bizarre and odd architectural style. A lot of money goes into rebuilding stately homes, and I don't know of a case, and I hope if someone does know of it, they'll email me with it. I don't know of a case of somebody taking a neoclassical structure or a former abbey and converting it into neo-Saracenic. You know, it's an available style. It's all over print culture. And it does exist in a few places, but outside of people's gardens, where you'll sometimes see garden buildings, for example, built along these lines, Chinese pagodas abound in 18th century gardens, for example, but we don't really see it being put into bricks and mortar. And I think we should listen to that and ask what that tells us. And
then Angela also asks, and I think you started to answer this, in fact, in the way you were talking, but is there any reception history of this kind of pseudo-Indian styled building?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there is remarkably little. There is some evidence, particularly in caricature, of people finding it very, very vulgar. And that fits with the wider visual representation of the nabob as being very, very vulgar, which indeed some of them, let's be frank, were. The main, in terms of Season-Cote, the main literature focuses on Brighton Pavilion. And even there, it's more family rumor than a direct line that we can trace, as we do as historians, from document to document, demonstrating that one is the model for the other. And I think it's important that the future George IV does what he does in Brighton. He's obviously a man with a particular approach to consumption and to consumer life, but he's also going to become the king. He has an entrenched social status, a place within society and the state that is miles away from these nouveau riche East India Company men. And he can, I think, readily afford to use that neo-Mughal style in a way that the nouveau riche really can't afford to do.
Right, yes, money is the root of so much of what you've been talking about, isn't it? I don't think there are any other general questions. There's one comment from Olivette Ortele I just wanted to read to you. This is an outstanding lecture. Let's make sure it's widely shared. Thank you, Professor Finn. The reference to Renan is incredibly and sadly timely, both in 2020 Britain and France. I think that is, I agree very much with that sentiment, and quoting Renan and nationalism and how it works. Powerful, very powerful. I hope I haven't omitted anybody, but I think this is the moment when we should allow Professor Finn, who has been working for the Society since early today, and indeed endlessly in the last 4 years, whose energies have been indefatigable and enviable across all the time that I've watched her at work. I think we should allow her to take a break. But thank you, Margot, for an enlightening, brilliant, provocative lecture, which I hope will get a very wide audience beyond that we already have here. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you all very much indeed for coming and for listening. And we will get it up on our YouTube video in due course. So thank you so much. Lovely to see so many of familiar faces and so many unfamiliar ones.